And what you're seeing in the bottom corner is what's called the Polycom room.
Okay.
And Judge Patterson's using the other one, so we'll be reserving this one all afternoon. The problem is my corner picture is over it. I wonder if I can move that.
Oh.
Have a seat right there.
Good afternoon, Mr. Weesey. Can you hear me?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. Everyone is here. Deputy Herman, I'm going to put you in the waiting room, okay?
Okay.
We'll be back with you. I just wanted you to know you're connected. And I've got Galaxy Note 9. Let's see who this is.
The video begins with a detailed discussion about the setup at the jail, where 2 rooms are being used for proceedings. The speaker explains that one room, known as a Polycom room, is reserved for the afternoon, while Judge Patterson is using the other. There's a brief mention of a technical issue with the corner picture, which is quickly resolved. Deputy Herman is introduced and placed in the waiting room, ensuring everyone is connected and ready. The session officially starts with the judge confirming the presence of all parties, including the defendant, Ethan Dingman, and the attorneys. The judge also notes that the session is being live-streamed on YouTube and recorded for official purposes, setting the stage for the proceedings.
You could play electronic euchre somehow, but you're going to be waiting for a while. We'll be back with you, okay?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to turn the record on. This is the time and date for the preliminary examination in the matter of People versus Ethan Nicholas Dingman. Mr. Dingman, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think it's okay to take your mask off. We've met before. It's been some time. I saw you at the early part of the proceedings, and then Judge Patterson handled some things. I'm here once again. Your lawyer, Mr. Weesey, is here. Amy Shepard, the special prosecuting attorney, is here on behalf of the state. Also present is Chief Mark Brinkert from the Colon Police Department, who's the officer in charge of this case. We have a couple of spectators whose cameras are turned off and their microphones are muted, but they're here on representatives of the victim and the defendant, and they're watching. We are live on YouTube and we are on the Zoom platform, and this is being recorded. We also have several people here in the courtroom.
The judge begins by formally reading the charges against Ethan Dingman, which include open murder for the alleged killing of Todd Schwartz on November 21st, 2019. He explains that Dingman has undergone a lengthy competency hearing and has been found fit to proceed with the preliminary examination. The prosecutor, Amy Shepard, and the defense attorney, Mr. Way, are introduced, and the judge outlines the stipulations agreed upon by both parties. These stipulations include the admission of exhibits and the testimony of Dr. Joyce D. Young, the forensic pathologist. A minor technical glitch interrupts the session briefly, but is quickly resolved, and the proceedings continue without further issues.
Life imprisonment. The attorneys have done a lot of work in this case up to this date. You spent a number of months at the forensic center and some related hospitalizations. After a lengthy hearing, Judge Patterson issued an order finding that you were competent to proceed to preliminary examination. That order was signed it was filed April 30th. And the matter was set for preliminary examination before me here today. Ms. Shepard, are the people ready to proceed?
Sorry, Your Honor. The one thing I was just sending an email to check is I believed that Dr. Joyce DeYoung should have been in the waiting room as well. We had confirmation from her office that she could participate today, but it doesn't sound like she was currently in the waiting room. I just sent an email to her assistant. Even if she's not in the waiting room right now, we could proceed, yes.
All right. And Mr. Weesey, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Now, I don't want to keep mispronouncing your name if I'm saying it wrong. That's how I've been saying it since we met. But how do I say your name? Mr. Weesey?
You got it, Your Honor. Bill Weeks.
All right. Okay, Weesey. That's the way I thought it was. All right. Mr. Dingman, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Madam Prosecutor?
Thank you, Your Honor. Before we begin with proofs, we do have a few stipulations that I believe we can put on the record. The first is that Dr. Joyce DeYoung, when she does participate and is here, we were stipulating to her testifying as an expert in the field of forensic pathology. So we do not have to go through the initial qualification part of her exam. Secondarily, I have sent copies of People's Proposed Exhibits 1 through 14 to Mr. Weesey. My understanding is that he would stipulate to each of those for the purposes of exam only for their admission at preliminary examination. Finally, we have one more stipulation that the items described in People's Exhibits 13 and 14, the 2 Michigan State Police Crime Laboratory reports, that those are the same items that were recovered from Mr. Dingman during the course of this investigation. The stipulation is for chain purposes, that there wouldn't be a challenge to that. Again, for the purposes only of preliminary examination. I believe that that summarizes the totality of the stipulations that we have at this point.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We had a failure for a moment. That's never happened before. Mr. Weesey, can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, I gotta. Hopefully it didn't disrupt our live chat. Dr. DeYoung is here.
Okay.
Give me just a moment. That's never happened before, to my knowledge. Yes, all right, we're good. All right, secondly, you're going to, for preliminary examination purposes, stipulate to exhibits 1 through 14 of the people. Is that correct?
It is.
And thirdly, you will stipulate for preliminary examination purposes only that the items referred to in exhibit 13 and 14 were obtained from the defendant.
That's correct.
Ms. Shepard, do you wish to make any sort of opening statement or simply proceed with the proofs?
I'd like to just proceed with the proofs, and the first witness that we would call is Dr. Joyce DeYoung.
All right, give me just a moment.
Dr. Joyce D. Young is called as a first witness and is sworn in to provide her testimony. She begins by detailing her extensive background, including her role as a forensic pathologist and medical examiner for multiple counties in Michigan. Dr. Young explains a standard procedure for conducting autopsies, which include external and internal examinations, photographing injuries, and collecting body fluids for toxicology testing. She confirms that she performed the autopsy on Todd Schwartz on November 22, 2019. Following these standard procedures, Dr. Young then starts describing the injuries she observed, beginning with a laceration on the back of Schwartz's head and a contra-coup injury to the front of the brain, which indicates significant trauma.
The last time, I'm Judge Middleton. We've met over the years. You may not remember me. I was a witness in a Kalamazoo case that involved a 18-year-old homicide that occurred when I was prosecutor. And I may have dealt with you a time or two when I was the county prosecutor.
Sure.
But you're in the right courtroom. And
Okay.
so I'm going to start with asking you to raise your right hand, if you would. Would you state your name for the record?
Joyce Lynn DeYoung,
You spell your last name, please?
DEJONG.
You swear or affirm any testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
Yes, I do.
Madam Prosecutor?
Thank you. Dr. DeYoung, before bringing you into the Zoom room, we have already stipulated to your expertise in the field of forensic pathology. But if you could please let us know where it is that you work and what it is that you do there.
So I work at the Western Michigan University Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine. I am the chair of the pathology department here, but part of my duties are to serve as a medical examiner for multiple counties in Michigan, including St. Joseph County.
And as part of being the medical examiner for these various counties, including St. Joseph County, it's part of your responsibility to perform autopsies on deceased individuals.
Yes,
And is part of that to determine the cause and manner of death for these individuals.
yes.
And is there a standard procedure that you follow to conduct this type of investigation?
Yes, there is.
And what's that standard procedure?
The standard procedure is to first gather a little bit of information about the circumstances in which a decedent was found. We then, that's just a routine matter before we actually look at the body. We then examine the body externally, however it's received, whether there's, and if there's clothing, we look at the body, we gather photographs with the clothing and personal effects on. Those are then removed. And the body is examined again without any clothing or personal effects on, and significant findings are noted, features of identification, that type of thing. We'll collect body fluids for toxicologic and sometimes other testing. We then do an internal examination where incisions are made into the chest, abdomen, and the head so that we can see the organs of the neck, chest, abdomen, and the organs and the brain itself. Following that, we'll also do X-rays as indicated. I then take all of the information that's gathered from the examination, and I will form that into a report that's issued that documents those findings.
Now, were you employed in this capacity on November 22 of 2019?
Yes,
And in this role as medical examiner, did you perform an autopsy on a Todd Schwartz?
yes, I did.
And how are you able to identify Mr. Schwartz?
I believe he was identified to us just by a government ID, and then he had tags attached to him that reflected that.
Dr. Young continues her testimony by describing the petechiae, tiny hemorrhages, found on Todd Schwartz's face, eyes, and mouth, which are often associated with strangulation. She provides a detailed account of the injuries to the neck, including contusions, bruises, and fractures to the thyroid cartilage, all of which are consistent with strangulation. Additionally, she mentions bruises and hemorrhaging on the chest, which are indicative of blunt force trauma. Dr. Young explains that these injuries were likely inflicted around the same time, and that Schwartz was alive when they occurred. Her testimony paints a vivid picture of the violent nature of the injuries and their potential impact on the victim's cause of death.
There was a lot of hemorrhage of the tissues surrounding that. When we reflected the scalp, we could see that there was significant tissue damage to that area. The skull itself was intact, but there was a bruise on the brain on the opposite side, so the bruise on the brain was actually in the front of the head, which is something that happens. It's something called a contre coup injury. It means that there was a strike to the back of his head, and the brain traveled frontwards, and then when it struck the front of the skull, it bruised. So that's a contre coup injury to the front of the brain.
believe that's French. Could you spell that for her?
Sure. I believe it's spelled Contrecoup, contre coup.
Or maybe Latin, but, all right, thank you.
Then the other significant findings on the head, including the face and some of the other surfaces like around the eyes, even inside the mouth, were petechiae, a lot of tiny pinpoint hemorrhages that were visible on much of his face and on the mucosal surfaces of the eyes and the mouth. The examination of the neck was significant. On the outside of the neck, there were a number of contusions or bruises and just red erythematous meaning red marks on the outside of the neck.
All right, now, I know petechiae, and we can certainly see that. What was the other term you just used?
Erythematous.
You're gonna,
I'm gonna do my best spelling that. Erythematous. I believe that's correct. Erythematous. It basically means there's erythema. There is redness on the front of the neck. There were multiple red marks and bruising on the front of the neck. On the inside of the neck, there were injuries. There were areas of bleeding on the inside, and the thyroid cartilage, which is basically the Adam's apple or the voice box. This too had it was fractured in 3 places. The other significant finding, and I'll group this with the neck because it's part of the exam that we do with the neck, is that we looked at the tongue as well, and the sides of the tongue also had hemorrhages as if he had bitten his tongue on both sides and the back. There was hemorrhage there. On the front of the chest, moving down now, there were multiple bruises on the front of his chest, and then there was actually when we reflect the skin away from the chest, we could see that there was also some hemorrhage beneath these areas as well, between the skin and the sternum and the chest plate as well. Those were the kind of summary of the injuries that we're seeing.
Based on your expertise, are you able to tell what, I guess, let's go back from the beginning of the injuries that you discussed. In regards to this laceration, the part of the body where this located, how much bleeding, if any, would you anticipate to come from that type of laceration?
Well, it was a scalp injury, and the scalp has a lot of blood vessels, and I would expect a fair amount of bleeding to come from that. It was like a full thickness injury, and I'm going to look at my autopsy report a second so that to refresh my memory on how long it was. Yeah, it was 1 3/4 inches long, so a fairly significant tear in the skin, and like I mentioned, I would expect a fair amount of bleeding to come from that.
And then in regards to the hemorrhaging in the skin in that area, what would cause that?
Well, it was a blunt force. The pattern of injury is the pattern that we see when a moving head strikes an object. So that would have been either from a fall or from a shove or being pushed. But when the moving head strikes an object, it will cause this tear in the skin, but then almost simultaneously the bruise to the front of the brain.
Right. It's the contre coup injury that you earlier described.
Correct.
And then in regards to the petechiae that you found on the face and the mucous membranes of the eyes and in the mouth, what would cause that type of injury?
Petechiae can be caused by a number of sources. They're not necessarily specific for example, for a strangulation, but they certainly are oftentimes seen in association with strangulations. So, but other people with women might have facial petechiae during childbirth, just anything that causes significant increased pressure of the vasculature, the blood vessels within the within an area, in this case in the head, that would cause these petechiae. So they're small vessels that rupture.
And moving on to then these injuries that you found on the neck, the contusions and bruises and red marks on the neck, were you able to determine what would cause these types of injuries?
Well, those types of injuries, they are also, in general, a type of blunt force. But in this case, when we're looking at everything and putting everything together, these were blunt force marks, most likely from hands. It didn't, although I can't rule out there wasn't some kind of ligature involved here, but these are injuries to the neck from likely from hands.
Dr. Young concludes her testimony by stating that the cause of death was multiple injuries, including strangulation and blunt force trauma. She emphasizes that the manner of death was homicide, meaning the injuries were inflicted by another person. The prosecutor moves to admit Dr. Young's autopsy report as evidence, and the defense raises no objections, leading the judge to formally admit the report. During cross-examination, the defense attorney asks Dr. Young if the blunt force injury alone could have caused death. She responds that both injuries contribute to the death, and that it is difficult to separate their effects. The session concludes with the judge thanking Dr. Young for her testimony and moving forward with the proceedings.
Seizure or something, but it'd be from biting their own tongue.
In regards to the multiple bruises and hemorrhaging that you found in the chest area, were you able to determine what might inflict that type of injury?
Well, these are also blunt force injuries. I can't specifically say what caused them, other than there was some blunt force that was applied to the anterior chest wall, and whether that's about what I can say. Some of them actually look somewhat linear, but I don't know what specifically it was that caused those. They're not specific enough to say, well, this was caused from this particular object, just that they're there.
Based on your examination of Mr. Schwartz in this matter, were you able to form an opinion as to his cause and manner of death?
Yes.
And what opinion did you reach?
So my opinion as the cause of death of Mr. Schwartz was multiple injuries, including strangulation and blunt force.
And was that based on the observations that you made that you've just testified to?
Right, and it's sort of putting everything together.
And when you say strangulation, can you kind of describe what it is, what you mean by that?
Sure. So strangulation really, it's in this case, it's compression of the structures of the neck, resulting in inadequate supply of oxygen to the brain. So, so by compressing both blood vessels that supply blood to the heart, blocking the blood from returning from the brain, and then also airway compression.
Now, in regards to these blunt force injuries that you've observed, as well as the injuries that were consistent with the type of strangulation, are you able to determine whether they were all inflicted at the same time or if one was inflicted before the other?
They looked consistent with being around the same time. However, in and of themselves, it's not, if I look at the entire picture, including just, we had an investigator out with scene photos and recognizing that, the position that Mr. Schwartz was found in with the blood pooling around his head and these injuries on his neck, it certainly, I believe he was alive when the head injury, he certainly was alive when the head injury occurred, and he was alive when the neck injuries occurred. So I don't believe that when I look at the totality of everything all the information available, I believe they all were at about the same time. But in and of themselves, if I were only shown the injuries without any other information, one of them could have occurred an hour before. or, you know, an hour more.
Along those lines, if you indicated that just being shown the injuries that you could reach the conclusion that he was potentially alive when these injuries were inflicted, are you able to tell if after these injuries were inflicted, he would be able to cough or move his tongue or anything like that before passing away?